On a rain-soaked night in January, chaos erupted within the royal household. The usual calm and order that defined the palace's operations were thrown into disarray as security rushed to respond to an urgent situation. Advisors were summoned in the dead of night, their phones taken from them, ensuring no word could leave the palace grounds. The reason? King Charles had uncovered something so deeply unsettling about Prince Louis that it forced him to call an emergency meeting, one that would send shockwaves through the monarchy. Before we dive into the implications of this earth-shattering revelation, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It all began with a whisper, a quiet stir inside the walls of Buckingham Palace well past the dead of night. As the clock ticked past 2:00 a.m., blacked-out vehicles surged into the courtyard, their presence a stark contrast against the darkness. Helicopters hovered low above the palace, casting ominous shadows across the royal roof. Those few still awake in nearby quarters could hear the guards moving with an unsettling precision, something not seen since the death of the Queen. This wasn't protocol, this was panic. A high-ranking palace aide, who later requested anonymity, described the scene as nothing less than a red alert situation. Phones rang off the hook, documents were sealed, and corridors were locked down. The Prime Minister remained completely unaware, and the press had no clue what was happening behind the palace doors. What had landed on King Charles's desk that night wasn't something that could be explained away with a simple press release. It called for something far more drastic, an unprecedented lockdown. Within moments, the King's senior advisors were ushered into the marble hall, where secrecy and darkness enveloped them. This wasn't a scheduled meeting, it wasn't expected, nor was it optional. Upon entering, their phones were immediately confiscated. They were given no explanation, save for one chilling sentence: "This is about the line of succession." Inside the room, King Charles sat, reportedly pale, barely able to speak, his hands clutching a manila folder so tightly that the edges began to crease. His demeanor was described as haunted, as if the weight of something incomprehensible had settled upon him. Some say he muttered the words, "He knows he shouldn't know," under his breath. And then in the oppressive silence, a single name escaped his lips: Louis. The folder, now shrouded in whispers and intrigue, allegedly contained a psychological and behavioral assessment of the young prince. But it hadn't arrived by the usual royal courier. Instead, it had been delivered by a former MI5 operative with connections to the palace's security. Its contents remained sealed, but a leaked memo hinted at something far darker, words within it that spoke of an existential threat to monarchical continuity. Shortly after, Camilla, reportedly disturbed by the commotion, entered the room only to be turned away by Charles himself. "This isn't for you," he allegedly said, according to one senior aide. "This stays within the circle." It was the first time in decades that even the Queen Consort had been excluded from royal deliberations for nearly an hour. No aides were allowed inside, no updates were shared, not a single word leaked from the chamber. Outside the room, whispers among the staff grew louder, the silence thick with dread. It wasn't long before those whispers morphed into rumors. One footman, his voice barely above a whisper, was overheard saying, "It's about Louis, something S happened, something bad." Another staff member whispered that the young prince had been moved, taken from Kensington Palace under the guise of a family visit. But what could possibly justify such urgency? What hidden truth could be so earth-shattering that it could shake a monarch to his core, forcing him into complete isolation? What was so alarming about Prince Louis, the youngest royal, that it drove the palace to such extreme measures of secrecy? To most, Louis was the cheeky, playful prince, the mischievous child who captured the public's heart with his antics during the Platinum Jubilee and his candid, often impish expressions. He was the bright spot, the delightful distraction in an otherwise solemn and controlled monarchy. His refusal to adhere to royal protocol at times seemed harmless, even cute. His little acts of rebellion were often chalked up to the innocence of youth. But behind the palace walls, far from the admiring eyes of the public, things were not so simple. For every playful grin and wide-eyed wonder, there were alarms quietly ringing, signs that couldn't be ignored, whispers of something far darker lurking beneath. What once seemed like youthful spontaneity, charming even, was gradually becoming something far more ominous. Beneath each innocent smile, there was a pattern, an unspoken message, a warning. It began with the dreams, night terrors that left the entire wing of the palace in disarray. Louis's cries would echo through the royal halls, so intense and unsettling that they woke up everyone in earshot. According to a longtime nanny who later spoke under the veil of anonymity, Louis would scream words, foreign, ancient words, that no child of his age should even be able to comprehend. The nanny recounted with visible distress how Louis would cry out phrases in Latin, invoking long-forgotten names and praying in tongues that chilled even the most seasoned members of the royal staff. "He has dreams that terrify him," the nanny confessed in hushed tones. "He speaks in ways no 5-year-old should." The nanny, alarmed and deeply concerned, tried to raise the issue to the higher-ups to warn them that something was clearly wrong. But instead of being listened to, she was swiftly replaced, her concerns dismissed and buried under layers of bureaucracy. To ensure her silence, she was made to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Meanwhile, the palace, a fortress of secrets, worked to cover up the growing concern. Rumors began to leak, but they were quickly dismissed as the usual unfounded gossip. Yet there were whispers that hinted at something far more disturbing. Louis had undergone psychological assessments, not at British institutions, but in foreign medical facilities, under assumed names in remote, inaccessible locations. The suggestion was clear. The truth about Louis was too dangerous to keep in the United Kingdom, too controversial for even the royal family to manage in public. Privately, William and Kate found themselves at odds. Kate, according to sources close to the family, had pleaded with her husband to remove Louis from the public eye entirely. She feared that the pressure of being thrust into the royal spotlight was taking an unbearable toll on their son. Something in Louis was changing, something profound and troubling, and it was no longer safe for him to live under the ever-watchful gaze of the crown. She believed that Louis's growing unease with his place in the royal family was pushing him to the brink, and something had to be done to protect him. But William, ever the dutiful heir to the throne, pushed back against her concerns. Duty, he argued, must come before personal feelings. He could not allow Louis to disappear from the public eye as much as it pained him. Exposure, not exile, was the royal way, and he believed his son would grow into his role. Yet behind the palace doors, Louis's behavior grew even more troubling. He wasn't just a playful child testing the limits anymore. He was becoming restless, defiant, and disturbingly aware of the dynamics around him. He would sit in silence, studying the people around him, mimicking their tones and expressions with an eerie accuracy that unsettled those who observed him. He would then make comments, ask questions, things that no child his age could possibly understand, let alone say. On one occasion, he reportedly turned to his mother and asked her with a chilling calmness, "What happens if I say no to the crown?" It wasn't a joke, it wasn't playful, it wasn't an innocent child's fantasy. It was a deeply unsettling question, a child at such a young age pondering his own place in the monarchy. A child so young yet already aware of the power dynamics at play, the weight of legacy on his shoulders. It was a question that shook Kate to her core. This was no longer about a boy with a playful spirit. This was a child who was beginning to grasp the full scope of what it meant to be a Windsor. In response, psychologists were quietly brought in to assess Louis, but in typical royal fashion, no records were kept under his name. Pseudonyms were used, and the sessions took place far from the watchful eyes of the public and the media. Louis's behavior continued to spiral. His isolation grew, with his appearances becoming increasingly rare. Family photos, once filled with the warmth of royal unity, now told a different story. The tension was palpable. His once joyful and carefree nature now seemed shadowed by something darker. His every move, his every word felt like an enigma the palace couldn't crack, couldn't define, and most dangerously, couldn't predict. The more they tried to contain him, the more they realized they were dealing with a child who seemed to already understand the prison that had been constructed around him. He wasn't simply misbehaving, he was responding to the constraints placed upon him, and that terrified them. It wasn't just that Louis was difficult to manage anymore. It was that he was unmanageable, and worse, he was becoming more self-aware with each passing day. There was no longer any question of whether he was misbehaving. This was something far more dangerous. Louis had already begun to understand the mechanisms of power that bound him. He had already begun to see the walls of the palace not as protection, but as a prison, a cage built by history, tradition, and a future. Hat wasn't his to decide, and he was beginning to push back against it. For the royal family, it wasn't just about containing a child's bad behavior. It was about controlling a child who was too smart for his own good, a child who could one day undermine the very foundations of the monarchy if left unchecked. They feared that Louis, in his innocence, could grow into something far more dangerous, a symbol of defiance. As the palace tried to move forward, the cracks in Louis's behavior were no longer just signs of a troubled child. They were the first tremors of a deeper rebellion. The world was watching a boy who seemed to have already outgrown the role he was born into, and the monarchy, the very institution that had withstood centuries of challenges, was faced with an unpredictable future, one that Louis unwittingly was at the center of. And that, more than anything, was the true terror of what was unfolding. Prince Louis was no longer seen as a harmless child. The playful, mischievous little boy who had once won the hearts of the public with his cheeky expressions and innocent antics had now transformed, in the eyes of those within the royal household, into something much more volatile. He was now viewed as a ticking time bomb, an unpredictable element in the royal equation. History is filled with spares, those born close enough to the crown to feel its weight, but never meant to claim it. These individuals have always been mere shadows of those in direct succession, but Louis wasn't like the others. He wasn't just the spare's spare. He was the unpredictable variable that Buckingham Palace never accounted for. For years, palace historians had warned, those who do not carry the crown often carry something far more dangerous. Those without a direct claim to the throne possess the freedom to act outside the boundaries of royal duty, unburdened by the rules that govern their higher-ranking family members. And in Louis's case, it was clear he had nothing to lose, and that more than anything unsettled King Charles the most. In Louis, Charles saw something far darker than the innocent, carefree child the public had come to adore. He saw fire, a wildness that couldn't be tamed, a force that no one in the royal household had the tools to control, a magnetic charm that, if left unchecked, could easily pull him out of the background and into the spotlight in ways that would shake the very core of the monarchy. The monarchy, built on tradition, duty, and stability, couldn't afford such unpredictability. In a rare moment of honesty, Charles confided in one of his advisors, his voice low with quiet desperation, "I will not let another Windsor bring this house down." The weight of this statement was not lost on anyone present. The family had already weathered scandal, tragedy, and betrayal, yet Louis's emergence was different. It wasn't about scandal, it wasn't about rebellion. It was about something far more dangerous, the unpredictability of love. When internal communications from Clarence House were leaked, the true extent of the worry became clear. Royal strategists expressed growing concern that Louis, in his unassuming way, was quietly overshadowing George, not in status but in presence. The young prince's charm, his defiance, and his unapologetic individuality had begun to capture the public's imagination in ways that George could not. The concern wasn't just about Louis misbehaving or being a disruptive influence, it was about him becoming beloved by the public. In a monarchy where the line of succession depends not just on blood, but on reverence, the prospect of Louis becoming adored was seen as nothing short of catastrophic. In a world where predictability was sacred, unpredictability was nothing less than treason. Kate, already exhausted by years of living in the spotlight, of protecting her children from the media's glare, was at her breaking point. In a private conversation with Charles, it said she broke down, begging him to allow Louis to live a normal childhood, free from the pressure, the expectations, and the harsh scrutiny of the media. She pleaded for her son to be given space to grow up without the weight of the monarchy on his shoulders, but Charles, as always, refused. And what followed was a silence between them, a cold, lingering silence that insiders say has never truly healed. The rift between husband and wife deepened, a quiet fracture that never fully mended. William, caught between his loyalty to the monarchy and his protective love for his children, found himself trapped. He was torn between the father he was born to obey and the son he didn't know how to protect. Friends close to the family described him as emotionally splintered, withdrawn, distant, and increasingly detached from royal duties. He struggled to reconcile his duties as the future king with the love he felt for his children, particularly Louis, who had become both the greatest threat to the monarchy and the one he feared he could never truly protect. Then came the report, the damning private evaluation from one of Britain's most elite prep schools. It was never intended to be public, but its contents were undeniable. The assessment described Louis as possessing a level of intelligence beyond his years, a manipulative intelligence that allowed him to understand and wield psychological leverage with startling effectiveness. The report indicated that Louis wasn't simply acting out or being rebellious, he was consciously strategizing. It was not chaos for the sake of chaos, it was calculated, deliberate behavior. Louis wasn't just being a child, he was operating, and that revelation terrified the palace. The idea that a child so young could possess such control over his environment, such an understanding of the mechanisms of power, was a frightening thought. So the whispers within the palace shifted into something more urgent: policy. The question was no longer whether Louis should be watched closely, but how closely, how tightly should the reins be pulled around him. Containment plans were drafted, strategies were laid out, and Louis, who had once been the darling of the public, became a symbol of fear and uncertainty. The palace could no longer afford to underestimate him. He was no longer just a child, he was a threat that couldn't be ignored. The secrecy surrounding Louis only intensified after the leak of a drawing he had created. What initially seemed like a harmless piece of child's art, a jagged crown split in two, with a young boy holding a matchstick, staring intently into the fracture, soon became a symbol of something far more profound. At first, the image was dismissed as a whimsical, if slightly unusual, creation of a young boy's imagination. But beneath the drawing, in barely legible handwriting, Louis had scrawled a cryptic phrase, "Non senti creatus," meaning, "I was not made for silence." The phrase sent shockwaves through the palace. It was not just a statement, it was a declaration. A child not yet old enough to fully understand the weight of his words had somehow managed to put into writing what many inside Buckingham Palace feared most, the beginning of a rebellion. The drawing was quickly pulled from the internet, but in those fleeting moments it sparked widespread speculation. What did it mean? Was it the innocent ramblings of a child, or was it a carefully crafted message, one that Louis knew would be understood by those who could read between the lines? The questions multiplied, and with each unanswered one, the mystery deepened. The palace's reaction was swift and severe. Legal teams were mobilized, issuing takedown notices across every platform, determined to scrub the drawing from existence. But this was no ordinary response. It was a panic response, a panic that betrayed the palace's growing fear. An internal investigation was launched to find the leak. Someone had betrayed them. Someone had let the world glimpse the cracks in the royal facade. A trusted aide, whose role was crucial in maintaining the palace's delicate balance of control, was dismissed without explanation. There were no goodbyes, no farewells, just a quiet, deliberate removal and another unsettling silence. Yet despite the palace's best efforts to close ranks and contain the damage, the tension inside the walls of Buckingham only grew. What followed was Louis's increasing silence. It was no longer about a child misbehaving or testing boundaries. It was about a child who had withdrawn completely, not just from his family, but from the world that had once adored him. He refused to speak to staff or tutors. His communication was limited to a few carefully guarded, cryptic notes passed through locked doors. These notes were exchanged with his siblings, George and Charlotte, notes that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. The contents of the notes were just as enigmatic as Louis himself. Each note was a puzzle, carefully constructed, filled with subtle messages that only those close to him could understand. They communicated in a language no one else could decipher, a silent code that spoke of rebellion, of defiance, and of a bond that was growing stronger and more impenetrable. George and Charlotte, once inseparable from Louis, began to change. The monarchy had failed to predict the effect Louis's isolation would have, not on him, but on them. Far from isolating Louis, his removal from the public eye only brought the siblings closer together. They began to pull away from the very institution that had defined their lives. They began to speak through gestures, through looks exchanged in fleeting moments, through a body language that could not be ignored. And in this silence, a rebellion was born, quiet, subtle, and yet more powerful than anything the palace could have anticipated. Behind closed doors, the royal family began to fracture. William, who had always been the dutiful heir, now found himself caught between two irreconcilable forces: his loyalty to the crown and his fierce love for his children. His duty as the future king demanded that he put the monarchy above all else, that he preserve the traditions and order that had been passed down through generations. But his father's monarchy was no longer just about tradition. It was about control, about silencing what could no longer be contained. And Louis had become the embodiment of everything the royal family could not control. William's internal conflict became a private hell. He had once believed that loyalty to the crown was the highest duty, that the monarchy's survival depended on his ability to toe the line and live by its rules. But now he was faced with a child, the very symbol of his future legacy, who was unwilling to follow those rules, unwilling to fit into the mold that had been created for him. How could he protect Louis, his own son, when his existence threatened the very structure he had sworn to uphold? How could he shield his children from the suffocating grip of the crown, when, in his heart, he knew that they were becoming victims of it? As the royal family fractured, so too did William's sense of self. He withdrew from royal engagements, stepping back from the public eye, emotionally splintered by the tension that was now an inescapable part of his life. He was no longer the confident future king. He was a man lost between duty and family, between the crown he was meant to wear and the children he could not protect. His once unwavering sense of purpose was now clouded by a profound sense of loss, of helplessness, as he watched his family unravel before his eyes. And then the report came, a private evaluation from one of Britain's most prestigious prep schools. This report was never meant to be seen by anyone outside the royal circle, but its conclusions were so damning that they couldn't be hidden forever. The assessment revealed that Louis possessed an intelligence that went beyond his years, a manipulative intelligence that allowed him to manipulate situations and people with startling effectiveness. It wasn't rebellion, it was strategy. Louis wasn't just misbehaving, he was actively operating, playing a game that no one had anticipated. The report suggested that Louis's behavior wasn't just a sign of a troubled child. It was the work of a mind too advanced for its age, one that had already learned the art of psychological leverage. The palace feared him not for his actions but for his mind. They feared what he could become if left unchecked, what he could do if he learned to use his intelligence and his charm to challenge the monarchy. The whispers within the palace became more urgent. The question was no longer whether Louis should be watched, it was how closely he should be monitored. The royal strategists, working behind closed doors, began to draw up containment plans, considering every option to ensure that Louis wouldn't become a threat to the very foundation of the monarchy.